Great. So we've already accomplished this one, and wanted to give a moment to Haley to kind of give a welcome and an overview of this effort entirely.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Haley DeMolling-Mella, and I'm the Youth Systems of Care Assistant Director here at the Mental Health and Recovery Board. And first, want to say thank you for being here. I'm really glad that you are able to dedicate an hour of your day to focus on infant and early childhood mental health. For those of you that are familiar with our work, this webinar series is part of our Building Strong Foundations grant initiative to expand and sustain early childhood mental health supports here in our community. I think Kate is going to share the rest of the webinar offerings in just a minute, but I wanted to say it's not
Yep,
too
that's
late
right
to
here if you want to talk. Thank
register.
you.
Oh, perfect. It's not too late to register for additional webinars. So if you want to sign up for more, you are welcome to either resubmit your registration or just email me and I can get you added to the rest of the series. I also am going to drop a flyer in our chat about a fan training that we're hosting in April. It's facilitating attuned interactions. Kate will also be facilitating that for us. So that's a three-part series, and I will put the flyer and the registration link in the chat for that. And at the end of the session today, you will also get a brief evaluation survey. That feedback is really important, not only for us to evaluate how the webinar series is going, but for our grant goals overall. It helps us guide future learning opportunities, so we really appreciate any feedback that you share. Um, as Kate said, she is recording this webinar, so we will send out the recording to everybody that was registered, as well as post it on our website at a later date. So all of that being said, thank you again for being here. Thank you for the incredible work that you do, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kate.
Great. And Haley, just thank you for the opportunity to share with you all what I've dedicated my career and passion to, which is infant and early childhood mental health. As Haley said, this is, an hour of your day that you're opting into. So it's also over lunchtime, which was both a pro of scheduling, but also takes you away from that time. So a couple people have asked already, please feel free to go off screen to eat and nourish yourselves. We're happy to have you here. There'll be a couple of times throughout where I have intentionally like pausing for reflection or feedback or questions, but please feel free to utilize the chat or to raise hand and discuss something in deeper content or with respect to your work or families that you've interacted with as this content is presented. But as Haley said, the today's is really sort of framing the rest of the series. So we'll touch on a couple of things that have the opportunity for deeper dives later. So number 2 is on attachment and relationships. That's later in February, very fitting for Valentine's Day, I guess, or the week of Valentine's Day. Then we'll talk session 3 in early March about reframing behavior. So how do we understand behavior in the moment and what that might be communicating other than just a bad time for the adults that are dealing with it. We'll then go into trauma and toxic stress, reflective practice for adults, caregiver mental health, supporting fathers and grand-led families, understanding developmental differences in this work with working with very young kids and their families, relationships and early care settings. So thinking about group settings and educational settings, observation and assessment. So how do we come to understand all of the complexities of a little one in front of us and their families, early language and social development and sort of the ties between those things, and then end with regulation in early childhood. So again, these will all be recorded and welcome to have you on any of them that meet your interest and or availability. Just a little bit about me. So my name is Kate Sweeney. I'm a clinical social worker by training, and am currently serving as an assistant extension professor, which is a funny title, I know. It just means I'm not a professor in the research track. I'm in the extension track, meaning helping apply work within communities. So I have the opportunity to work with Haley and others on the system of care work here in your region, and have had the opportunity to do that in a number of other ways as well. So again, thank you for caring a little bit about infant and early childhood mental health, and would love to hear from you as we interact around this content, around your roles currently, and if this is something that you're sort of extending into, or sort of see a need within your community, or something that you're very familiar with and work in this way as well. So our goal for the next now just under an hour is for this introductory webinar to explore the foundations of infant and early childhood mental health. So what do we mean by that term? ECMH or IECMH is also a fun acronym. There's always way too many vowels and acronyms in this work, but that's what we call it. Infant mental health is often also what it's called. So it can go by any of those domains, but essentially serving the mental health and social emotional needs of kids birth to 5, arguably birth to 8 as well. The age keeps ticking up as we get more of a developmental understanding of kids in need. But understanding the components of early brain development, the role of relationships in understanding young kids and their mental health skills and scaffolding, and the importance of early relational health. So hopefully you'll gain an understanding of the key principles in that work as an introduction, and again, delving into much more topics later on. But hopefully you'll get to walk away with a working definition of infant and early childhood mental health. We'll give you one, we can talk about it. The ability to explain how brain development and relational experiences are interconnected, particularly in this very early couple of years of a child's life, to identify what those key components of relational health are, and to recognize why and how early years matter, which is something that we need to convince all of our public policy and finance officials as well. But we can start with our collective here today. This is one of my favorite slides to use in really any training or discussion around early childhood. It's a quote from Jerry Seinfeld. He says a 2-year-old is kind of like having a blender, but you don't have the top for it, right? So they're messy, they're loud, they're often hilarious, but intense. Like it requires a lot of the adults. And one of the reasons why I like that quote, and sort of starting with this so much, and feel free to use it, borrow it, adapt it, is just it acknowledges the premise that kids and parenting and families are stressful, right? Even in the best of circumstance, or the most ideal and planned and resourced places, the moments of primary caregiving for very young kids is demanding and stressful. So much so that we call it the terrible 2s, the tantruming 3s. There's now a term called 4-nagers, like because they're 4, but they talk back like they're teenagers, right? So like colloquially, that's a hard word for me to say, sorry. Our society has agreed that like this is a hard time for adults, right? And yet so much of it, when we think about infant mental health or early childhood mental health, we think about the individual kid, right? So a lot of what you're going to hear both today and in future webinars is really the frame of how do we think about the adult, both as contributing to, what this little one is the blender that's popped off of this little one's top, but also the key to kind of responding and supporting that child. So often when people think about early childhood mental health or infant mental health, people think about the kid that is as bad, or the child labeled here as naughty. I often say, and my daughter is now in 7th grade, so this is a rather old story, but when she was in her 3s and 4s class in preschool, there were 2 boys named Hudson. And really early on, a lot of the kids were calling them good Hudson and bad Hudson, right? And like they probably got that from the teachers, right? And I'm sure both Hudsons knew. And we had her mom's a social worker, so we had lots of discussions about how we shouldn't call them that at home. And bad Hudson wasn't bad. I mean, he may be a little bit more demanding or energetic, right? He now is an honor roll in middle school with my daughter. There was, no part of what he was doing was above the scope of sort of being labeled bad, but also sort of indicating, higher need. He was maybe more demanding at certain times, right? But this idea that we only think about mental health for young kids often, or end up sort of labeling kids as behavior kids, or whatever the terminology in the halls that you walk in are. But really, our field, the sort of mental health providers and social workers and psychologists like to think about it in a very different way, right? So we know the importance of the early years, and really thinking about the mental health in early childhood as skill building. So the same way that you would build skills around literacy or gross motor skills, right? How do we think about building those social emotional skills? And this is just a little bit about the importance of the first 5 years, right? So, and this is something that I think our field has had to make a case for. It was sort of not assumed. A lot of times when you think about attention to kids, it really starts at kindergarten. We ask a lot of them when they get there. A lot has already sort of had to happen to make them successful in that setting. But we really think about like that's when you have the important sort of moments around learning and sort of that structure them for the rest of their years. What our field knows, and that this has been really solidified recently through a lot of the brain science that has come on board in the last 20 or so years now, but that early experiences shape a child's brain more so than later ones, partially because the brain is so malleable at that time, and just the trajectory of growth of both brain development and development of a child's growth in general during that time is higher than any other time during their life. So the first either 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 years, depending on the studies that you're looking at. But you can see here, they're talking about rapid brain growth. In the earliest years, babies form over 1 million neural connections. So the neurons firing and making connections, which is how we learn things like language and where things are in our home, et cetera. During that time. And by age 3, 80% of the brain is 80% of its adult size, meaning a lot of those connections and neurons have been laid out. This is where, the neurological pathways in the brain get paved the more that you use them, right? So there's lots of neurons firing earlier, and then the more that something is habituated or used, those pathways get paved and sort of solidified most often. So a lot of that is happening already by age 3, right? And really, unless you've had a lot of support around it as a caregiver, adults sort of misinterpret or misunderstand the opportunity for connection, for sort of growth of those neurons at that time, through things like regularly talking and interacting, the serve and return that happens within primary relationships and very young kids. We know that relationships matter, that there's no such thing as a baby without someone, right? That babies and young kids live in the context of their adults, right? So secure and responsive caregiving supports lay the groundwork for emotional regulation and learning. And anyone that has been around any kind of educational setting knows that you can have the best books and materials and the most secure seat in the classroom, but if you're not emotionally regulated, you're not going to be able to take in that information, right? So a lot of understanding of the more regulated the adults are in the child's life in early years, and the more regulated and consistent those routines and interactions are within that relationship, the more emotionally internally regulated that child will be. So we go from co-regulation to independent regulation skills. And so we've now sort of really made the case for why we're not just looking at a 3-year-old independently, but we need to understand the context of their people and their environment. COVID kind of made that case clearly for folks that weren't maybe in the sort of early childhood or mental health space. We know that health starts early, that there's lots of ties of, poor prenatal care or maternal health or lack of nutrition impacting birth outcomes and giving kids harder starts. We know that mental health counts. So there have been studies endorsing signs or qualifications of mental health conditions in up to 22% of babies that were endorsed in high stress, high poverty situations, and that early intervention improves outcomes, right? So that's been well documented. That intervention pays off. So 1/3 of toddlers who get early intervention services don't end up needing long-term special education supports later in in their years. And we know that, those early supports are often much less expensive than the later ones, right? That every dollar spent on early childhood can return up to $13 in long-term savings. And I would argue that those studies really need to be redone because those are from a good number of years ago. And, we know that there's been even more put into place and everything costs more. So the savings are arguably more beneficial as well. Just going to take a minute to see. Okay. Just wanted to attend to the chat real quick. So we know all those things. We know now we've had to make the case, and there've been, there's lots of literature, and it's now sort of gratified in that the first 5 years, the first 8 years of a child's life are incredibly important for setting the groundwork for their long-term outcomes. And yet, the supports for young kids and for families of young kids and for childcare supports and all those things are not really very stable in our country. So only 17% of eligible families receive childcare assistance when you look at it at the national level. Paid leave is often out of reach for many families. Early Head Start itself, which serves kids 0 to 3, serves just 11% of eligible children when you look at the national numbers. And over 40% of parents or primary care caregivers are reporting daily overwhelming stress, right? So we know the importance of this time, and yet we're not really organizing our society in a way to respond in kind. So again, thank you for attending to this topic. So when we think about infant and early childhood mental health, and we think about not that as responsive and we have the bad or naughty kid, right? But as preventative, there are some key principles that we'll talk through. So the first is that relationships are central, right? Again, kids can't do this work alone, and they're also not exhibiting what's only happening internally for them. So, we're always impacted by the people around us, but young kids more so than others because they're so developmentally dependent on their primary caregivers for everything. We're very different than, the experiences of, horses or other wildlife that, get to run and gallop immediately after they're born, right? So babies are naturally pulled in to read the cues and to draw in the adults of their in their world for all of their essential needs, arguably until they're 18, but at least for the first several years, right? The development happens in context, so in family and culture and community, right? And so as we're assessing need and development and understanding that, both understanding how their other domains of development might be presenting or impacting their social emotional development progress, and just all those things within the context of their environment and people. And we always try to be strengths-based and prevention focused. So a lot of the interventions and supports and services are, again, not waiting for the bad to happen, but how do we think about this in a more prevention focused and frankly, adult focused way. So we'll talk about that as we go through. So I said I would share with you a different definition for infant and early childhood mental health than this idea of the bad kid, right? And this is probably one that you've seen before. It's not new. It's really kind of considered the nationally endorsed definition of infant mental health from 0 to 3 and others. And it's that the infant and early childhood mental health is the developing capacity of the child to do these 3 things. So first, form from birth to 5 years of age, form close relationships, right? And again, when you think about developing capacity, you're thinking along the trajectory of those first 5 years, right? Really 6 years, because you're a whole year until you're 1, right? So that whole time, we're looking at forming close relationships first with those people that are closest to them, but then we're seeing that developing capacity spill into peer relationships and other things as they age. The second developing capacity that we're seeing along the trajectory here is to experience, tolerate, and express a range of emotions without lasting collapse. And I think, the second part of that phrase is the most important. First, it's a full range of emotions, right? And we know that for any of you that work in sort of adolescent or adult mental health, it's actually more clinically concerning if you don't see a sort of proper range of emotions being able to be expressed, right? So this is not like the the healthy kids are only happy kids, right? We want kids to be able to be upset, bored, sad, whatever. But it's how do they have that emotion and be able to identify it in themselves, express it in a positive way, or an allowable way within that given setting, right? Um, without lasting collapse. So, what does the recovery look like? And that is again so tied to regulation, which is why you're thinking first about co-regulation with their primary people, and then that goes into individual regulation internal to themselves as that skill develops. And the third is to explore the environment and learn, right? And some of that has to do with sort of the environmental setup, but their ability to kind of walk into a space and as developmentally appropriate for their age um, and culture and temperament, engage in the environment, sort of learn similarities and differences from that environment, and all of that sort of shapes how they understand and interact with the world. So that's what I would offer to you as the definition of infant and early childhood mental health. Um, and in order to accomplish that, that requires sort of thorough assessments to understand the root of behavior and the role that development and environment plays in that. Emotional literacy skills, so the same way that we think about literacy skills with respect to reading, whether it be English or Spanish or any other language, the ability to identify, label, and have ways to express and release emotions is considered a child's full emotional literacy. So a lot of what we do in this work, whether it's through the lens of attachment or trauma or sensory supports, et cetera, is give appropriate supports to teach those things, to practice those things for the adults that are caring for that child. And again, all this is done on focusing on adult regulation as well, so that if anybody has seen a not so calm adult try to calm down an upset child, it doesn't work very well, right? So much of this is how do we think about supporting adult regulation first, and that's in the work. So when we think about social emotional readiness, again, like kindergarten as sort of the marker of like when societally we sort of begin to pour money into kids. We think about the goals of kindergarten. The children that are viewed as ready for kindergarten typically exhibit high attention, the ability to approach and to adapt, coupled by low activity and low reactivity, right? So that when they're in a kindergarten setting, and many of them are sort of so thoughtfully planned by a teacher, but there's so many sort of things in that room that are both, attractive and distracting, right? And they're, we're asking them to kind of interpret, which loud noise in the hallway they react to versus don't, right? And interpret the rules of the setting that they just walk into. We're asking kids at that kindergarten level. So again, whether they're freshly 5 or even 5.5, these characteristics tend to be especially valued by teachers who describe a child as teachable or school ready, right? So that that child is going to be naturally drawn to sort of wanting to listen and attend to the task, like that, a little bit of a child that's seeking praise for following directions and that type of a thing, versus equally as sort of attending to the peer that's having a hard time as the teacher that's trying to ask them to do something, right? So we're asking them to kind of internally select what they're focusing on, which again requires a lot of scaffolding of internal regulation. And since many children enter formal school earlier by attending pre-K or even 3K classrooms, there needs to be kind of more thought into like how are we orienting them into these spaces, so that they're developmentally anchored into where they are. They don't just need shorter desks and chairs, right? But they need activities and lengths of time that operate in sort of more of a developmentally structured setup, so that they're set up to be successful, right? So when we're thinking about what we would see as sort of a healthy in terms of social emotional or sort of mental health 4 or 5-year-old in that setting, we're really under the hood of that asking for a lot of regulation and a lot of their own emotional acuity are already on board, and a lot of that is done through play. So when you pick your kid up from wherever they are during the day, and you ask how their day was, and they say, or what did you do today? And they say, I just played. Often parents can express, feeling a little bit frustrated by that because they don't know what they did or know how to interact with that. But through play, kids develop communication skills. They learn self-regulation skills. So even the task of like turn taking or choosing something or negotiating between a peer between the blue and red crown, that requires self-regulation skills, that requires communication skills, that requires cognitive skills, right? Of problem solving, even if you're looking at putting puzzle pieces together, right? That's both problem solving. It didn't fit this way, but if I turn it a little bit this way, the pieces will fit together. And also resilience, like, right, it didn't work the first time. And so how do I continue a task that feels hard? They're learning new information to extend their thinking, right? And a lot of that has to do with the give and take. When we're called into classrooms to support, there can be a lot of environmental things that you do, but one of the direct sort of coaching opportunities for educators that can be so impactful is to really increase their responsivity and communication to kids when they're not giving a teaching instruction, right? But if a child comes to them in communication, you can do so much either in play or just response to what they're saying to extend their thinking about something, right? And again, those are laying the foundation for skills that we'll hopefully use for a long time. And I won't, just in service of time, read and comment on all of the other things, but just know that all of these things are accomplished through play. And all of these things are made so much more meaningful when you're able to engage in play as a young child with somebody that's really important to you, right? So often families and caregivers will say, not only do they not have the time to play with their kid, they're trying to get, people home at the right time and food on the table at the right time and people in bed at the right time and all those things. But, so much of, infusing just a little bit of play around problem solving, around resolving conflicts, that kind of thing can make moments of stress really opportunities for moments of connection, and that can pay dividends for that child and that relationship for sure. I'm going to play a video for you that is a little bit old, but the University of Minnesota did a series of videos on understanding the brain architecture and how what's happening within a child's brain during this time period is so impacted by their environment and their people. And all that's going on around them. So I've tested this a number of times, but PowerPoint and Zoom always plays games on you. So I'm going to hit play and then just pause really, really quickly. If somebody wouldn't mind just going off of mute or giving me a thumbs up to let me know that you can hear the sound, that would be great. Did sound come through?
Sound is good.
Yes.
Amazing. Appreciate you all. Okay, I'll let this play.
Our brains allow us to perceive and interact with the world around us. This 3-pound mass of tissue contains nearly 40 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses or connections, sending information to the rest of our body at a rate of nearly 500 messages per second. Science tells us that early brain development affects the course of our later lives. Years of accumulated research on how the brain develops and functions now informs best practices in the nurturing of children. But there remains a disconnect between this science and what is practiced in communities. The gap between knowledge and practice has huge consequences for society.
If we look at the cost of healthcare, the achievement gap, look at crime, the problems that we face in society today, science tells us that we actually know the root of these problems. Many of these problems actually go back to early childhood.
I get a lot of referrals from school for behavioral problems. A lot of times teachers refer kids due to acting out behaviors, attentional problems, learning problems. Although we call them school-related behaviors, lots of times they've developed years and years before. They just start showing when children enter school.
We all know that some children get to school much more capable of learning than others, and that how they arrive at school will influence how they do for the rest of their academic careers. So one way to think about the development of brain architecture in early childhood is it's a lot like building a house.
And as when building a house, the developing brain requires a sturdy foundation. A proper brain foundation needs responsive and nurturing adults.
Our brains definitely need stimulation to be able to wire the brain up correctly. Left in a crib, a child cannot provide the stimulation its brain needs to form a healthy and solid brain architecture.
Responsive parenting is key to a process called pruning. Pruning is how the brain creates the most efficient pathways possible. During the first year of life, there are periods of growth where nearly 700 synapses are formed a second, creating connections for language, hearing, vision, and movement. However, not all these connections are needed or are efficient. Pruning back the pathways that are rarely used allows the brain to send signals more quickly. These pathways are the foundation for later learning, forming our brain architecture. Babies' brains grow by building themselves from the bottom up.
So you're sculpting the brain by the information that the brain is processing.
By the age of 2, our brains have already made some giant developmental leaps. Regions of the brain that control vision and hearing have already developed. Areas that handle language and communication skills, which are heavily dependent upon interaction with adults, are rapidly developing. And the part of our brain that deals with higher-order reasoning and cognitive functions is at its crucial beginning phase of development.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sadly, many children do not receive the attention they need to form healthy brain architecture.
By age 2, we can already predict third-grade reading scores. So many of the things that we think are happening later in life are actually have their beginnings in early childhood, in infancy.
The ability to predict third-grade reading skills at age 2 has to do with understanding brain architecture. The part of the brain that controls language and communication has its largest growth spurt during a child's first 4 years. Without a responsive adult at this age, the pruning process begins to disconnect underused pathways. This leads to language and reading difficulties later.
The brain doesn't work in pieces. It works as a coherent whole. So if the foundation isn't set well, it sends poor information to those higher centers. And what starts looking like a problem in this part of the brain ends up being a problem in attention regulation and in higher order cognition. So brain architecture is not set by 2 years of age. There's still a lot happening. But what happens early influences what happens later. Skill begets skill.
Research shows that children who have had positive adult interaction, adequate nutrition, and minimal exposure to stress arrive at school better able to learn than those who have grown up with those factors. What adults can do to help a child's developing brain reach its full potential will be covered in the video Serve and Return.
So any takeaways from that? Anything that stood out to you?
Just a good reminder.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Monica. A reminder for us, and what this shows here in the chart is a little bit of what they were talking about there. That like the colors tie to the same colored words here. So this is when the brain is sort of most habituated to learn a given thing. So emotional control is this sort of highlighter pink, habitual ways of responding. So these are kids that, there's a reason why there's a high sort of correlation of like thumb sucking or pacifier sucking at that time. So that's like a habitual way to kind of respond and self-soothe, right? Understanding symbols, numbers, peer social skills, all of these things can be learned later. It requires so much more attention and that kind of a thing. But you see sort of all of these sort of natural pathways are very high within the first 3 years, and really sort of beginning to level off or having completed its level off before age 5. And again, this is, distinction here is because when most kids are in a formal school setting. The reading level insight at age 2 surprised me. Yeah, exactly. And again, like not to say that like if that hasn't all been built by then the third grade reading level is already set, but that it's on that trajectory, right? And so how do we really think about understanding the importance of the work that happens in these early years, and supporting it? And this is just a visual of what she was referencing in the video of the brain growing from the bottom up and the inside out, right? So again, this is from a team that's done a lot of work around at the Institute for Safe Families in Philadelphia, Dr. Linda Chamberlain. But this idea that these building blocks of the brain, so and this is literally if you were to take your hand like a fist and curl your fingers under and then have your thumb outside. That is a sort of very rudimental brain, right? But this would be the brain stem, right? The midbrain, the limbic, and the cortex, right? So the prefrontal cortex is the front part. That's where, all of the sort of higher level thinking, decision-making, et cetera, happens. And that all of those parts correspond to these tasks here. So body temperature, respiration. So really the like very physiological things are down here, digestion, sleep. And then you get to motor regulation, emotional reactivity, sexual behavior, attachment, affiliation, problem solving, abstract thought. And we know that, there are often, and we see this in kids, we see this in adults, right? Where they're asked to do something requiring some of these high level tasks. And if these things aren't securely in place, there's so much more effort that goes to those higher level tasks. Video reminded me of another one I've seen about early education and caregiving in Oklahoma. There was a stakeholder talking about the quality care epidemic in their state and that children don't fall behind in pre-K or K. They often come already behind in skills. Yes, I mean, we're hearing that across the board. Really, we've never sort of stopped hearing it post-pandemic, right? That kids are coming into care, into very early educational settings with higher and louder need with respect to behavior and sort of all domains of development. For sure. And, we're seeing the impact of that on the early care and education workforce for sure too. So when we look at mental health across childhood, so this sort of darker, blue or periwinkle blue is kids 2 to 5, and the lighter blue is 8 to 17, and so that's sort of globally thought of as like school-aged kids. But what you see is that across any diagnosis, there's a little bit of a higher prevalence in the 8 to 17. And part of that is because some diagnoses aren't really on board or sort of considered applicable until kids are at that later adolescent stage. But when you look at all of these that are pulled out here, so serious emotional disorders, anxiety, disruptive behavior disorder. So I think thinking about that as like a, physical moments of upset that are disruptive and therefore seen as a disorder. ADHD or sort of attention problems and depression. They're really, pretty numerologically on par. There was, I think, a lot of concern early on that if you give kids labels around certain diagnoses that it can be stigmatizing for them or sort of, blame them for something that happened very early in their label them rather for something that happened very early in their life. What we know now is that when lifelong struggles around a given presentation are finally diagnosed, families will talk about, having seen the trajectory of that throughout the course. And we know that if something is understood as anxiety versus trauma versus, a sensory issue versus an attention issue, it might look similar in the moment, right? It might look like, especially if they're very young, it might look like sort of physically falling out or not being able to tolerate the setting or the task. But the intervention is going to be very different based on that, right? So we've moved into a space now where, and we have a webinar that will be dedicated to this around just sort of really in-depth assessment and diagnosis and the importance of that in very, very young kids. But we know that that all of these things, can and do come into play in the early years, and that intervention is important there. I'll make a note that there's been some commentary recently that depression, especially in young boys, is often misseen as disruptive behavior because it looks more like angry and aggressive. But when explored more clinically, it can actually be signs of depression, just presented in a way that maybe isn't, what we have interpreted it as societally, which is more sort of withdrawn and slow and sad. But all of these things, come on board early. And so when we think about the field of infant and early childhood mental health, it offers us an opportunity to kind of really have a paradigm shift about how we're understanding behavior in very young kids. So, previously the focus was more on cognitive and motor development in these early years. And those are all incredibly important, but so is social emotional development. And really, a flip to sort of seeing that as foundational for the other developmental domains, right? So that if you have those things on board, then the task for your brain of learning, hopscotch, of learning, to read, et cetera, is made easier because the foundation of those brain pathways are there. Another paradigm shift is that the expectation that children naturally learn social emotional skills, that they naturally understand behaviors and behavior expectations and rules of a given setting. And that's flipped to the idea of really, being so important, not only able to, but so important to intentionally teach behavior expectations and reinforce proactive strategies to sort of scaffold those skills of social emotional learning. That, some kids do sort of naturally absorb that from their environment, but many, just like we would never expect a child to learn numbers without adult intervention, require that intentional teaching. And so that's been a paradigm shift. Similarly, moving from just reacting to behavior in the moment to creating proactive solutions to address what the challenging behavior is communicating. And that, again, where do we spend the calories is often the flip there. And I know a couple of you on this call spend your days supporting adults in the community to do that. And this flip from, challenging behavior being seen as intentional to really, how do we support caregivers, whether it's their frustration with the behavior in the moment or sort of globally, because overwhelmed adults can be really poor reporters of behavior, right? They say he screams all day, every hour of the day he's screaming. And it's like, well, he has to at least take in air at some point, right? But that's sort of more of an expression of how they're feeling, but not seeing it as intentional, that like he's choosing to defy me or to make this trip to Target or the grocery store really hard at this moment. But how do we understand, his behavior or her behavior as communicating a need and then responding to the need instead of responding to the behavior? So that sort of paradigm shift there. Any questions or comments? I know I'm kind of going over, by going over the sort of introduction to infant mental health, there's sort of a lot of things to quickly cover. And as I said, we'll in future webinars be able to delve more deeply into many of these things. But happy to pause for any questions that folks have now. Okay, I will keep chugging along. So, when we think about social and emotional developmental milestones, both in terms of what kids can be asked to do and what they can tolerate and sort of how to help them with the next milestone themselves, there's a lot of sort of lack of awareness unless you've had the opportunity to learn directly, what these milestones are, that we generally in our society, think about, when kids would take their first steps, when they would speak their first words, when they would move from, on to sort of trying solid foods. Like those are sort of much more sort of publicly known milestones. But this idea of, when are there periods of natural withdrawal, of natural sort of, stranger anxiety, as we call it, and what are the sort of biological roots of that, and those types of things. When are kids, expected to be able to sort of sit and attend to something for 2 minutes at a time, and all those types of things. So any resources that can be supported for anybody working with kids, with very young kids and their families, can be really helpful. And often when we're helping them, we're helping families or educator or provider respond to a particular child that's quite challenging, kind of understanding like where are they with respect to their social emotional domains, and how do we kind of build things to help them be successful in those activities, is often it can feel like a low lift when a teacher is expressing a willingness to leave the field entirely because this is so hard, but often sort of those very concrete and structural things can what just puts the lid back on the pot, right, and can help that interaction be much more successful. So we will, in a later webinar, go over just understanding social emotional development and developmental differences and needs, and both like how to talk to families about it and also how to structure any interventions around it. Another sort of pillar of infant mental health, or infant and early childhood mental health, if you want to make the phrase a little bit longer, it's that the importance of primary caregivers. And I think I've said it already in this hour, but this quote here from Daniel Siegel, who is an interpersonal neurobiologist, which is I'm convinced a term he made up himself because that was not on the list of topics that you could major in when I went to college. But he talks about experience as being biology. Parents and or caregivers are the active sculptors of their children's growing brains. So at the cellular level, so like the epigenetics that are passed between parent and child biologically sort of comes into play. Brain development, so again, how they're responding and sort of supporting interactions in an environment to either really help that brain development sort of grow or stifle that brain development for whatever reason, and their own social behaviors. So how is the parent attuned to their own stress? How are they scaffolding learning and patterns, is really key. So if you walk away with sort of one takeaway from today's discussion, it's that, the work of infant mental health is really always going to include the adults in that child's life. And often, early childhood mental health providers are thinking, very much about both, how do we help the adult understand and sort of respond to their kids in a more productive way, and also sort of what are the needs or supports for them within their own stress or mental health or sort of activities of daily living so that they can do those things. So I always say to folks working directly with families, and that you might be there for the child, but that it's not being nosy and it's not beyond your scope of work to talk with caregivers about, their level of stress, their level of other things that might be impacting that work, because you can have great resources otherwise, but if they're not okay, then the work that you're doing, that you're there to do on behalf of the child, is going to be limited in that way. When we think about components of relational health, and we talked about many of these things already, but the idea of co-regulation, right? So that, everything that you think about doing physically with a baby is really rooted around this idea of co-regulation. And often if you were able to sort of support the intentionality of that, that can go dividends in supporting the relational health. So often when we see disruption in co-regulation or sort of difficulty there, it's we're seeing low self-efficacy on the part of the parents, that they don't know how to soothe or respond to their baby, and it can sort of compound in their own perception of their ability to manage the situation, which we know can make people sort of more rigid and anxious rather than less. And so, anything that we can do to kind of really support that relationship is always key, which is why when working directly with families with this sort of infant mental health lens, we want to think about, and with childcare providers and educators as well, you want to think about how do you not disrupt the relationship. So like the old lens of like, I'll just go in and model how to do it doesn't always translate into that dynamic. But instead, how can you support and coach the person that's there to do that with you. And then, you're the coach on their shoulder versus the star kicker who came in and did it perfectly when they're having a hard time with it. And we'll talk about that more in future webinars as well. But there's been lots of studies throughout the trauma literature around the importance of dependable and consistent relationships as being protective factors when there is exposure to environmental or personal trauma. So this idea that you need just one person to help you regulate, so co-regulate, and to help you sort of make meaning of what's happening. It has been proven in that work as well. And this idea of repair after rupture in these components of relational health is really important. So, you're never going to always understand what your kid needs or always have the patience to respond to it in that way or the ability. And so much of this is not being the perfect parent or the perfect caregiver that never, misreads what your kid is needing and therefore the tantrum gets bigger. But how do you talk with them about, I'm sorry I wasn't able to stop my phone call right away and get you the cup that fell, blah blah blah. And so this idea of that being more important. I had a clinical supervisor who talked about when you mend a fence, it's actually a stronger part of it than the rest of the fence itself. So this idea of supporting caregivers to embrace this idea of repairing after a rupture, saying, I was not able to meet your need or not understanding what you needed, or I was having a bad day myself, et cetera, can go really, really far, especially in this very early age. I would argue that now having kids that are officially teenagers, or at least one of them, it goes really far no matter how old they are. This idea of not being the perfect parent, but the parent that is really focused on them, and that relationship is really important. And moments of shared joy, if you can ask a caregiver something that indicates their delight in their child, even if they are stressed, exhausted, and frustrated with that child, that can be a really important thing to be able to both support them in seeing, and just an indicator of positive relational health for that dyad. We're going to spend a lot more time in 2 weeks on attachment, but just know that this is a phrase that is not new to any of us. It's been in sort of our society and in the mental health sort of space for a very long time. But that it's really this idea that, these initial relationships and the patterns that exist between them really set up not only a child's ability to self-regulate and to turn to others for help and support, but something that we call in the infant mental health world, their internal working model. So how they make sense of things, of when I need help, someone's there or not, right? Or we'll talk about sort of much more about attachment. I want to give it its due. I know we just have a few more minutes left, but that's just mostly a teaser. I think for the sake of time, we'll move this to the attachment piece as well. But again, I said this already in this hour, that a lot of this work around infant mental health is really about adults. And so this is a great video that came out a good number of years ago now, from Harvard Center for the Developing Child, about adult capacities, both at the interpersonal or relational level, but also at the societal level, and how that impacts the way in which and the space in which young kids grow up. So more on that soon. Sorry. And we have another webinar dedicated specifically to trauma as well, but just want to acknowledge the interplay between exposure to trauma and attachment, both in, again, sort of the strengths-based perspective of when there is attachment, it can be a protective factor against significant trauma symptoms, and that it can be a disruption when there is attachment and as an introduction to infant mental health, it felt important to attend to that as well. That when parents or caregivers facilitate regulation by doing any of the things that you see here, that's really where you're seeing the trajectory around it being protective or not so much with respect to big T or little t traumas that we see come up for kids in the first couple of years of life. But you can see, all of these things, their self-efficacy, their confidence in their parent-child relationship, and their ability to manage their own emotions, their ability to kind of understand similarities and differences in them and their child, and how their child, might need something different than them in the moment, and to attend to that is very key here as well. We talked before about environments as well. So much of sort of how the adults are doing depends on sort of what the routines and consistency in the environment looks like and feels like. And often routines or tasks are where you'll see the highest moments of sort of conflict or stress with respect to, getting out the door, finishing your meal, etc. And so really supporting caregivers in sort of understanding the importance of routines and predictability for kids and their security, and sort of having those in place as a full stop. It's hard to go from like no routine at all to like, please put yourself to sleep for 8 hours, right? And so how do we sort of think about small doses of a day that could benefit from the introduction of a routine if that's not in place already? And we know that, a lot of this work, again, is really made most effective by focusing on not only the whole child, so the child in context of their family and environment, but what interventions or supports are needed on that end as well. And then I'll close with this. So Jerry Paul, who is considered the grandmother of reflective practice in infant mental health, put out a book through 0 to 3's press that is no longer in press, but I pulled some of the key components for you here. But what she says is how you are is as important as what you do in making a positive difference for infant toddlers and their families. Meaning like how we show up, how we bring the work, not just the work that we bring, is sort of seen as very worthwhile to attending to within this work of infant mental health. And so, she talks about these guiding principles, that behavior has meaning, that you cannot assume that our initial understanding of the meaning of another's behavior is correct or complete. And she extends that. So it's not just trying to understand what on earth this 3-year-old is demanding because they just asked for a banana and then they got it and they don't like it, but the same thing for their adults, right? So how do we kind of have a read on, understand what their behavior means, but extend it as well, like take in more data about what their behavior might mean, because it might present as one way and might really be around anxiety or fear or advocacy or something else, right? Everyone wants things to be better. They might not show up in that way, but everyone wants this to be better. So even, the parent that is falling short, they want to be there. And so how do we help them to do that? You are yourself in your role. So how you are in your specific role depends on all the things that we bring to that, and all that people read in of our role, right? And so just acknowledging that in the dynamic between us and families in our work. She says, don't just do something, stand there and pay attention, right? So sometimes when we want to by ourselves, prove effective, we'll come in with some advice or a task or some sort of solution first before we gather all the data, right? And so part of what she's saying here is, try to stand there and pay attention first. Don't do something first. Honor the person that you're meeting with first. Remember relationships. Do unto others as you would have others do unto others, right? So that we don't always do it for ourselves, but like, how are we supporting people in the way that we would recommend? And so those are the key pillars of infant mental health for her. I'm going to put an evaluation link in the chat as Haley referenced, and you can have a minute or two to just complete that now. And would love to ask you though, in the chat, if you're willing, to just share anything that you heard today that you'll take with you, whether, as Monica, you said about the video, it's not necessarily brand new information, but something that maybe remembered or heard in a different way. Would love to sort of hear that in the chat as I pull down the slides and find the evaluation link. Oh, Haley, you beat me to it. Thank you so much. So it's a Qualtrics link from, it says UConn, so University of Connecticut on there. And if folks wouldn't mind filling that out, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
If it's okay with you, I can also send it to the group.
That'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah, people have things that they need to jump on to right away. No problem. I'm just going to read a couple of the comments in the chat. Yeah, the importance of intervening during pregnancy to educate parents of the importance of the early years. Yeah, absolutely. Repair after rupture is super impactful. Agreed, Emily. Well, thank you all for being on. I'm happy to stay if people had questions or anything like that. Haley, do you think people will want the slides? I can PDF them for sure, too.
Yeah, that would be great. If you want to send me that in the recording, I can get it out to everybody.
Beautiful.
Perfect. Thanks, Kate. Thanks,
Great.
everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.